Well, oh yes, and welcome. Welcome to In the Court of the Wenton Knave, because we're doing the LSO album. Oh yes. You know, I did say about some of the 80s releases of rock albums were not quite up to the standard of the 70s stuff, and that's possibly because, well, the general argument is that perhaps he was more interested in the other stuff he was doing, like the orchestral stuff. I do think that perhaps, you know, you could make a really good album out of Man from Utopia and Drowning Witch rather than splitting them over two albums. And, you know, the album Baby Snakes, which I really like, is a bit superfluous, really. So what was he doing during all that time? Well, this is the first time we got to hear what he was doing with the LSO album. There's actually two parts to it. This is the first part I'm talking about now. He released the second part in 1987, so a few years later. And the reason being he wasn't happy with the performance and was actually holding back, hoping to fix it. But technology hadn't moved on as much as he'd hoped and wasn't able to fix it, or so he says. The question is, can you tell? In many ways, this is the follow-up to Orchestral Favourites. It's his next orchestral album. The huge difference being that was a 40-piece orchestra. This is a 100-piece symphony orchestra, the full-size LSO, playing Zappa stuff. There is an argument perhaps that his music wasn't suited to that kind of size of orchestra, maybe. A lot of the time he just doesn't seem to use a lot of the orchestra. It doesn't sound like he does. When he does, it's quite spectacular, but maybe it just doesn't suit the LSO in the way it suited the smaller orchestras he's worked with. Maybe it's not that kind of music, but it is really good. The process started. He wanted the Syracuse Symphony Orchestra in New York. Couldn't get them, so his next choice was to go to England and have the BBC Symphony Orchestra play it, and they weren't available, so he had to set off with the LSO. It's interesting that he saw the BBC Symphony Orchestra as being more capable of playing his stuff than the LSO, which surprises me a bit. Maybe the LSO were very, very conservative at the time. Perhaps that's part of the problem, if indeed there is a problem. He did say some of the stuff. His words were, "It's quite unusual," so it's not going to be suited to all players. And he'd been contacted by a lot of different orchestras by this point, all wanting him to play stuff, but also wanting him to pay for stuff. And I think perhaps the perception was of him being like Pink Floyd or Led Zeppelin or something, and a lot of money. And of course he didn't. Whatever he spent on a project was merely what he made on the previous project. So whatever he made, he put into the next project. That was all he could do. He wasn't a millionaire. So yeah, this was a compromise for him from his perspective. Apparently, it was performed at the Barbican, the London Barbican, and he was not happy when he arrived there. He felt it was too small, wasn't suitable, and there was a big row erupted and all that stuff. He also had the usual nonsense from British tabloids. Thanks, British tabloids, once again. Basically being arseholes as they do. The Daily Mail's review of it was actually that, oh well, everyone thought there'd be a riot, obviously, because the hippies are there listening to classical music. That's wrong, obviously. And they also admitted they couldn't tell the difference between the orchestra tuning up and the band playing. So, you know, Britain. And there was also complaints about the humour. They couldn't cope with something that's serious and has humour in it. It's you know, everything has to be loaded and pretentious and very, very serious. And Zappa's just above that. And that's difficult for people to understand. It wasn't only the press he had problems with, or the organisers, it was also members of the orchestras as well. Apparently, when they had their last break before the final recording and final chance to get some stuff down, the trumpet section decided to go to the pub over the road and came back 15 minutes late, and then the orchestra refused to record for a further 15 minutes afterwards to make up for it, to finish off the performance. It's just so typically British, isn't it? Face palm. I think we've all experienced similar things like that, haven't we? But despite all of that, this is a positive thing because it's a brilliant album. There are positive things involved with it. You know, he's got Ed Mann on there. He's got Chad Wackerman playing some drums on there. And I think that possibly the most interesting thing about it is with the orchestra playing off with the rock drums. It's really interesting and kind of unique. I've not really heard it quite like that before. But also, he brought along his own soloist, David Ocker, on clarinet. I don't know what the orchestra must have thought of that. I'm sure they had their own principal clarinetist. So, yeah, that kind of gone down well. The conductor was Kent Nagano, who was very impressed with Zappa's music. I think he saw a preview, possibly the score of The Perfect Stranger, which we'll talk about next week. Was very, very, very impressed. And he said, you know, that usually to get to that level of composition, you need a master's degree. But the problem with people with master's degree are, you know, they're institutionalised and they've lost all their creativity in the process of being forced into the academia, which is one of the reasons why Zappa is so important. The first track is the first movement of In Dacron. Straight away, it just kicks straight in there with a great, awkward string melody, which Zappa fans are going to like. I'm sure he knew what he was doing putting that first, because straight away you're hooked in. And there's some more sort of stuff I would call kind of Warner Brothers stuff. That's what I'd call it, the big sweeping sort of humorous stuff. A lot of that on Gregory Peccary as well, which is pleasant, but not amazing, I think. But then it ends with a really quiet, scary bit into the second movement, which is a lot better. It starts with an evil chord. It's all much more urgent. The drums come in. Big crashes. It's very familiar orchestral music in many ways, so it just doesn't feel quite as progressive as orchestral favourites. I can't quite put my finger on why that is. Maybe because it's a big orchestra. But once the drums get going, it rocks, and that's great. Ending's a bit long, fades out. Track 3 is the first movement of Sad Jane. This is much less bombastic, much more pensive, relatively unique in the Zappa orchestral canon, and something that's quite held back and quite reserved in some ways. Interestingly though, it is based on a guitar solo, which is a normal Zappa thing, but it's based on a guitar solo from 1968, supposedly. Transcribed by Ian Underwood and then orchestralised here. That's a good word. Particularly on this piece, there's very little sign of it being a 100-piece orchestra. He's not utilising the whole orchestra, but that's probably a good thing, I think, to be honest. It's really in the second movement, track 4, where things start to pick up, and there's a proper rhythm. Stuff going on. I think often my favourite bits of the album, ironically, where it rocks. And there's a couple of cool little piano bits. There's a bit at the end where the piano comes in, which is very cool. But there is a section which seems like the ending, but it's kind of like a false ending, which sounds a hell of a lot like the end of Dancing with the Moon at Night by Genesis, actually. I don't think that's a homage. It's just a coincidence. But track 5 is the start of Mo and Herb's Vacation. I think this is the highlight of this particular album. The first track being about 5 minutes, so similar sort of length to the other tracks. And I think that's one of the best bits on the album, actually. I think it's excellent. Really showcasing the clarinet. There's lots of solo clarinet on there, and lots of clarinet drums juxtaposition, which, I mean, in a way suggests, well, why the orchestra there? They're only doing little bits, so they could have overdubbed that later, maybe. Maybe not. Just lots of fun, so that's a good one. Second movement of Mo and Herb's Vacation. You got some sort of long sliding violins, and it's here we get to hear the orchestra. That's a lot of strings you're hearing on this. You know, really good. And it gets evil and scary. And then really, really scary when it gets going at the end. Finally, predictably, the third movement, which is the longest track on the album, 12 minutes 50, is the big bombastic one. And it all goes crazy with big flourishes and stuff for 12 minutes. One of my favourite bits in it is right in the middle. There's a really cool little bit of piano, and at the end there's a klaxon. Brilliant ending to an album, actually. That's it. That's the end of... That is LSO Volume 1. See you next week.